Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining in. I'm Ganesh Kesari. Today we'll talk about how we can transform the customer experience. We'll look at the typical challenges that brands go through in engaging the customers and what is the right way to use data to convert into actionable customer intelligence and drive business outcomes. A quick introduction. I'm Ganesh, I'm co-founder and head of analytics at Gramna. We tell insights as stories. We use analytics to identify business insights and we convert them into engaging, insightful data stories. We work with 100 plus clients around the world. We advise them in adopting analytics and solving business problems by using data science. We help them achieve business ROI by adopting visual analytics. So this is consulting led, and we use our data science platform Gramix, which is now open sourced. And I'm passionate about simplifying data science for everyone. I regularly write and speak about this and explaining technical advanced concepts in simple English. So with that, let's get started with the session. I would like to start with a quick. So the question is, what is your current role in the organization? Do you work on the functional side of customer experience? Are you in a technology role, or are you working in some other function? Okay, so we've taken a minute. Let me close the poll now. And so here's what the results look like. A lot of people are on the technology side of customer experience, and many of you are working in other functions. About 8% in the functional role. Great. So let's resume. Okay. Getting back to our content. So I like starting with a story always. So today we'll be talking about the elephant and the 6 blind men. Some of you might have already heard about the story, but there's a surprise at the end. So stay with me. Once in a village, there lived 6 blind men who had heard tales about the elephant but had never encountered one in real life. So they were naturally very fascinated about the beast, and they kept imagining various things about the animal. So one day they happened to come across an elephant on the road, and the mahout was kind enough to let the blind men touch and feel the elephant for themselves. So each of them scrambled around the animal and touched the animal, just that they happened to touch different portions of its body. So the first person touched its tusk and said, "Now I know all about the elephant. It looks like a long spear." The second person said, who was touching the trunk, said, "It looks like a long snake." The third one, he said, "Both of you are wrong." He was incidentally touching the flapping ear, and he said, "An elephant is like a large fan." The fourth person, who was touching its side, said, "You're all mistaken. It looks like a long wall." And the fifth one, who was touching its leg, said, "It's more like a round circular tree trunk." And finally, the sixth person was touching its tail, and he said, "Are all of you crazy? It's nothing like what you're describing. An elephant is like a long rope." So as the elephant passed by, all 6 of them sat and started quarreling as to who was right, what an elephant really was like. So what relevance does this have to our session? So the elephant in the story is like our customer, and all these blind men are like the departments in an organization. Each of them are in touch with the customer at different points. They have some interaction and they have their own perspectives of what the customer wants. And unfortunately, none of it adds up. When they get into a discussion to try and decide how to satisfy the customer or what initiatives they must take, they don't seem to agree on anything. And in discussions, they keep going on and they don't see the elephant in the room. So a great story, and it's almost philosophical and has various interpretations. And it fits perfectly to customer experience, particularly today, because CX as we see it is broken. We've seen organizations working in silos. Teams don't see different aspects of the customer. They don't see each other, and they miss out to get a holistic view of the customer. Their view is myopic. They look at the customer based on the last interaction. They get judgmental based on whatever interaction they're having with the customer. They miss to see the historical viewpoint, and they also don't understand how the view is shaping and how it would influence their future. As a result, their actions are transactional. They don't look at a strategic view of how to engage with the customer and how to identify best ways of reselling to the customer or making the customer happy. The decisions they take are unscientific. They are not grounded in data. They are largely driven based on their viewpoints and the gut feel. As a result, the customer is left feeling isolated, and they get a cold shoulder treatment, and they don't feel engaged. This leads to lost revenue opportunities and ultimately a churned customer. So while all of this might seem obvious, and particularly when we look at our own interactions as customers with brands, how many of you have made calls to say your cable company, the customer service, assuming you are not satisfied with some of the packages, you talk to the customer service representative and say that you want to change the package or you want to relook at the billing, and after hearing you patiently, finally they say that that's all great, but you need to talk to the packages department. So they transfer you there. And then if you have questions about billing, probably another redirection. And finally, if you get frustrated and say that enough of all of this, I want to leave and I want to disconnect, they again patiently say that, okay, that's fine, but you'll have to talk to the retention department. So departments don't work together, and it leads to a lot of frustrations for customers, whether it is a telephonic interaction or a simple interaction on your app or in any other interaction that you might have with a brand. So this is something which we need to keep in mind when we get back to our roles while we serve our end customers. That's what we will be talking about today, on how we can handle these challenges. I like this quote from Kahel, which he expands CX into constant experimentation. We all need to keep trying, and we should learn from the mistakes so that we can improve with every iteration. And importantly, we need to get the data and try to understand the customer based on that and improve our interactions. We'll look at a 5-step framework that we follow at Gramner. We'll talk about how you can better listen to the customer, how you can really understand what the customer wants, what are the techniques available at your disposal. And then we'll see how we can contextualize and place all this feedback, all these insights at the right way to understand the customer based on the relationship they have at that point in time with the brand. And we'll also see how we can roll up all of these different interactions so that we get an integrated, holistic view of the customer, so that we don't end up like one of those blind men. And finally, we'll see how we can channel all of these to drive business decisions and take concrete actions on the ground, which can lead to business ROI. So firstly, the first step is to listen to customers everywhere. It might sound simple, but when we talk to organizations, we hear people complain all the time that they don't have enough data about their customer. They talk about how their data warehouse has very few streams and it doesn't have identifying personal details as well. And for anything, they have to wait for long, or they just don't get the data. But if you take a step back and look at all the streams and conversations that customers have, customers talk all the time and they leave vital clues in different interactions. They might be responding to voice of customer surveys, and VOC surveys, by the way, are decades old, but still continue to be an important source of understanding the customer. Because what better way to understand the customer rather than directly ask them? So that's one simple way which organizations still use. So customers could be responding to that. They might be leaving reviews on websites, or they might be sharing stuff on social media. They might be talking about what wowed them in an interaction or what really led to frustration. And by the way, when we talk about social media, it's not just always aspects of delight. Customers also talk about, like they get to Twitter and LinkedIn to vent out their frustration. But if you look at it, they find it as a way to get heard, just because through the regular channels their message doesn't go through to the company. So they find social media as a channel to raise their voice. And apart from all of these obvious channels, there are also other not so obvious ones, such as uh, clickstream data, where customers interact with the website, and based on the products they show interest on the website and the way they're using the mobile apps, they are vital clues as well. The clickstream or the mobile data can be useful. To put this into perspective, Gartner talks about three types of feedback. All of these can be slotted into three broad types. Direct feedback is when we uh, get in touch directly with the customer through, say, voice of customer surveys, or through direct one-on-one interviews with the customers to find what they really want. Indirect channel is when they don't intend to share feedback with the organization, but they leave reviews on websites or on social media. The exception being the frustration venting, which I talked about, which also, by the way, is a failure of traditional listening. And finally, inferred feedback is the non-obvious one, where clickstream data and all others, which usually it's being called as dark data in the industry, because these are sources which may be stored and archived purely for auditory and compliance purposes. Many organizations don't tap into this data, or they don't put this into the right perspective to combine these inferred feedback with the direct and indirect feedback. When you look at some sources from all of these channels, it can lead to significant customer feedback and insight into the customer's mind. Another reason why it's important to identify the data sources and make sure we connect to the right ones is because you need to get quality data in place before we do any analysis. Even exploratory analysis calls for quality data. But we've seen organizations make the mistake of directly jumping into AI. There is an hierarchy of needs for data science, quite like the Maslow's hierarchy you might be familiar with. You need to scale from the lower level to the higher level. At the lower level, we have collection of data. You might be collecting it through various sources, APIs, and several collection channels that you might set up. And then the data collected has to be moved, stored, and then it has to be transformed. We have the traditional ETL processes where we prepare the data so that it is in the right format for further exploration. Only after these three stages we can get into basic exploratory analysis. Stuff that you might get as basic reporting on Excel needs these three layers at the bottom to be in place. And as we scale up, we can start looking at more the next level machine learning algorithms. And finally, we can get into deep learning and AI, which really give deep insights, but you need to have all of these building blocks in place. So this is a good framework to think about what we need to have in place before we can start thinking about customer intelligence. So I wanted to get a quick sense of the channels that you listen to today. So let me start the second poll. What channels do you use to listen to the customer? If you use multiple channels, please check all that apply. Are these voice of customer surveys? Do you use social media, social listening to understand the customer? Do you use the website clickstream data? Do you do more with your contact center conversations? People might share details in terms of all of these might be either stored as audio conversations or might be stored in notes. Do you tap into that? Or are there any other sources that you might be looking at? So if yes, please mark others as well. I'll give it a few more seconds. I see some responses coming in. We have some responses. Let me close and share the results. Voice of customer, understandably, is the most popular. It continues to be popular. Social media, great. So that's the second most popular one. So there are more than website clickstream data. A lot of you seem to be using the contact center conversations and several other sources. Would be interested maybe to chat on what other sources that you use. Great. So let's move on. So now we've talked about listening to the customer, having identified the sources and we know where to listen to what kind of customer. The next step is in understanding what they want. So what can we do with the data? Firstly, we have different kinds of data. We have the quantitative data, which is the most common. We can apply a variety of techniques to identify insights from that. And there is textual data. Often the customer surveys have free-flowing fields where customers can fill in their textual comments. That has a lot of valuable signals. Apart from numbers and text, which almost everyone uses, there are these slightly unconventional types of data, the more unstructured types such as audio and video. We talked about contact center conversations, falls into the audio category. And there are also video logs of customer interactions, which could be used in certain cases if it has been, if the customer is okay with using those video logs or CCTV feeds. In those cases, that also could be used for further analysis. And all of these are useful types of data to tap into. But before we talk about applying any techniques on that, whether it is statistics or machine learning or deep learning, uh, um, an important pre-step is to ask the right business questions. Every analysis, every data science initiative should begin with asking the right business questions. And you should use your analytics toolkit to help answer those questions, not the other way around. And there are several kinds of questions that you can ask to understand your customers better. This is useful stages of maturity, which you can look at. You can directly talk about the higher levels, but this lays out a framework on what are the different categories of questions you should be asking. Firstly, the descriptive questions are helping you find out what's happening. Diagnostic gets into the causal aspects. Why is something happening? Predictive is a future gazing aspect in terms of what is likely to happen. Prescriptive is getting into the recommendation part on having answered all of this, what should I do? Examples from the customer experience perspective. In descriptive, operational reporting is pretty much common in every organization. The kind of questions we have are, did I improve on customer satisfaction? So the benefit being we can understand the customer better at a high level. This is broad patterns. In diagnostic, we ask deeper questions such as what led to lower satisfaction in the EMEA region. And in the predictive questions, we can talk about what will be my net promoter score the next quarter. And finally, in prescriptive, we are interested in finding out what actions we need to take to convert detractors into promoters. So this is where we need optimization techniques, scenario planning, and deeper machine learning or AI models, which will help us move to business recommendations. So it's useful to come up with a combination of questions and identify the right set of techniques from the toolbox, which will help you answer those questions. A common mistake we have seen organizations make is they hire data scientists. That's not a mistake, but they hire data scientists and let them float around the organization. And without a specific business mandate, they give them and they let them use the data and they ask them to do any magic they can with the data. So data scientists are more tuned to thinking about techniques and how to apply techniques to data. So they come up with all kinds of advanced techniques that they can apply on the data, and they come up with insights that they think is useful. They get a reality check when they present these results to the business teams, when they find out that most of these questions don't have any significance. Many of these are not questions which the business teams are trying to answer. So that becomes a fundamental disconnect. So to avoid that, always start with the business questions in mind. Look at a framework such as this. And once you validate the questions and check whether they're important enough for the business, that's when you need to start applying the techniques to try and answer them. So a quick poll again, the third one. Let's look at the maturity level of CX analytics. We talked about these 4 different types of analytics. If you can answer, what is the current maturity level in your organization. So the options are the organizations who do not use much data to understand the customer, they're still getting started. Descriptive analysis, where you're running basic summaries, the typical reports such as the basic operational reports and pivots. Diagnostic analysis, where you have analysts digging into the data to answer specific questions that say a senior management or a business team has asked. Predictive analysis is where you're looking at the forecasting prediction of parameters, and prescriptive is where you are getting into a data-driven decision and you're recommending decisions to business teams based on certain outputs from your data analysis. So I'll give it a few more seconds. Here's what the results look like. So apart from like about 80% of you use data for some aspect of customer experience analytics. A lot of you are in the descriptive and diagnostic stages, and some of you are into predictive and prescriptive analytics. We've looked at the customer, listened to them, and we've identified insights from some of the interactions. Is that sufficient? Do we already know what decisions we need to take? We are not there yet. We need to contextualize these insights on the customer journey map. Why is that important, and what is a customer journey map? For those of you who are not very familiar with journey steps and journey maps, here's a quick reasoning why we need to get into that. So this is a typical customer feedback, similar to what you might find on Amazon or in any other B2B interaction. The customer here says, I loved the product features and the super quick onboarding, but the great experience did not continue while using your product. Your support teams have been helpful, but I'm not sure whether I'll buy again. So some strong statements. There also seem to be some positive statements. So what do you make of this feedback? So when you run text analytics on this, you might get a sentiment score. And when you are trying to apply this and understand who's the customer and which channel it's coming from, it gives you some details, but this may not lead to decisions. So if you were to place all of this feedback in the right context, and by the way, the customer here is talking about multiple aspects. They're talking about product features, they're talking about onboarding, they have reached out to the support teams, and they're also talking about a purchase decision, a repurchase decision. So how do you place this into the right context? McKinsey shares a useful customer journey step framework. So they talk about 6 stages in any customer life cycle. Firstly, a customer identifies the company and the offering and does some research on how good they are and how well they meet the customer's needs. Stage 2 is when they make a decision and they purchase the product or the solution. Stage 3 is when they onboard the customer. The customer is onboarded, and in some cases you'll have to customize or co-develop to onboard the customer. And stage 4 is when you have certain issues and you have to deal with the issues. And stage 5, hopefully it should be longer, is when the customer is actively using the product. They have different experiences, but they're using the product. And finally, stage 6 is when they come to a point where they need to reorder or make a decision whether they want to continue or not. So these 6 stages broadly fit into most customer journeys, most businesses. There could be some variations in terms of what you call these based on the business, specific business an organization is in, or they might customize by adding 1 or 2 stages additionally based on the specifics of the life cycle. But broadly, you can take these as the journey steps, and they are very useful starting points for you to look at the customer experience journey steps. So now that we understand that these journey steps are important and every customer interaction can be slotted into one of these, it will help us to understand how many customers are in different stages. Are more customers in the use product phase, which an organization would like to have, or are the customers, a lot of them are in the identify and select and buy stage for newly launched products. This will be heavy in the early stages. So it will be useful to understand how many customers or prospects are there in each of the stages, how strong an organization's offering is and an organization's processes in each of these stages. And if there are issues, where should an organization focus their budget and which should they improve? And all of this helps them place the feedback in the right perspective. So now if we go back to the earlier feedback, we'll do that. But before that, I wanted to talk about how you place the interaction into the customer journey step. So there are three ways where you can identify and place the interaction. Firstly is by looking at the customer. In some cases, just by looking at the customer or a prospect, you can tell that this is their position in the journey. There are people who are still in the evaluation stages, or they are part of the lead generation cycle, and you're having your pre-sales and sales teams are having interactions. In which case, just based on the customer, you already know that they fall into the identify stage. Where that is not sufficient to distinguish, you need to use the context. There is additional metadata which you can collect with every interaction. It's not just a feedback which comes in, how you're getting that feedback. For example, the channel the feedback is coming through. Are customers reaching out and giving this feedback in the customer service support centers? So in which case, this potentially will fall into the issues or the use product phase. So that gives additional clues. However, the customer and context will help only so much. What's most important is to look at the content, the actual message or the interaction itself, and analyze the content to find out what the customer is really saying. Because a lot of customers who are in the use stage might be trying to make a repurchase, and they would give feedback which an organization should look at and fix from that perspective. So that way, it's important to look at all these three, and content is more important, and it's generally tougher. So how do you identify which stage an interaction belongs to based on the content? For that, we'll use the earlier example. We had this comment, and we've looked at the journey steps which we saw in the earlier slide. So if we have to break this comment and look at which journey step it falls into. So there are 5 broad aspects the customer is talking about, which is shown in the underlined sentence. I love the product features is one aspect. Super quick onboarding is the second one. The great experience did not continue while using your product is a third aspect. So as you can see, it's not clearly separated by sentences. So customers, the way they write it, it is not grammatically perfect, and it is free flowing. So we need to be able to understand and break the sentences to find what a customer is talking about. So we've identified these 5 fragments. The first one talks about product features and potentially can fall into the identify stage. Super quick onboarding falls into the customize stage, where after making the purchase, you're trying to onboard the customer. Experience while using the product, naturally this falls into the use product stage, and they're reaching out to support teams for issues, dealing with the issues. And finally, reorder is the last state. So here we have been able to understand the 5 journey steps a customer has been talking about in a single comment, in a single interaction. And additionally, we can also understand, is the customer happy or unhappy about each of these aspects? We can find out that there are 3 aspects or 3 journey steps which the customer is talking about in a positive vein. They're happy about it. But there are 2 which they're not so happy about, and it so happens that the one on use product seems to be a strong comment. And this is influencing the repurchase decision. So which means that in spite of the number of positive feedback being 3, this single feedback is strong enough that it might lead to customer churn. So now we get a sense of how slotting the feedback into journey steps and trying to understand the emotion or the kind of feedback for each of these will be helpful to understand every single customer and every single interaction. When we roll this up across all the interactions, across all the customers, we can get a very good sense of which journey step the organization is performing strong on, where they need to focus their energies. And the next step, we will also talk about where you need to channelize your energies. It is not an equal attention spread to all of these journey steps. We'll come to that, but so far we've been able to contextualize the feedback into the journey steps. So we've covered 3 steps: listen to the customer, understand the customer, and contextualize the feedback. Step 4 is to evaluate the integrated experience. So how can we piece together the different feedback coming in through different channels, or the feedback coming into the different teams? How can we get them all together to look at a holistic view of the customer, so that we don't make the same mistake as the blind men? So in case you're wondering whether that example is strong enough and applicable to a B2B or a B2C context, so here's more support from McKinsey, where they talk about the different touch points. And the common mistake which organizations do is they spend energies in optimizing the touch points. Wherever they see a customer interacting with one of their teams, they try to improve those processes. They put in additional tools, and they train the people to make sure those touch points are improved. And often they set some benchmark and say that if I've achieved a certain percent of improvement, then probably I'm doing good. Even if you reach, say, 85 to 90% of performance in each of these touch points, it may not translate to a happy customer. If you're curious, here's why. So you might have achieved 90% or 85% for each of these individual touch points, but when you look at the end-to-end customer journey, it's not an average of all of these experiences. Effectively, it's a multiplication, and numerically speaking, wherein the overall satisfaction is a product of all of these individual satisfaction. So you can see that the overall satisfaction level drops to 60% from what you had for any of these individual touch points. So this is another reason why you need to look at the entire customer journey and see how we can integrate all of this feedback which comes in from different channels, and see how we can piece them all together. So now that we have seen the need, how can we do that? In reality, this is extremely tough. Imagine the kind of feedback coming in from different places. Voice of customer survey is polling a different audience. You might have hundreds or thousands of customers who give feedback. And on the other hand, we have, say, social media feedback. You might potentially have hundreds of thousands of comments coming in, which talk about different aspects, and a lot of it ends up to be junk. So each channel has different audience giving feedback. The volume is different. The aspects, the context of feedback is different. When they reach out to, when they respond to voice of customer surveys, they're answering a specific question. So that is a context. Whereas in social media, it could be based on whatever is in their mind, what is driving that interaction. So it is very difficult to join all of these data streams. There's no, in technical terms, there is no primary key. So it's going to be difficult to piece them, but it is possible. How do you do it? You have to normalize all of these sources and normalize the data in an attempt to bring them closer. You can't make them perfectly fit, but there is a way to normalize and look at whether it is in terms of population. You look at a minimum threshold, and then there are surveys which are on different rating scales. Some could be 1 to 10, some could be 1 to 5, others could be responses which have numbers and percentage. You'll have to firstly normalize that. Second, you have to aggregate the insights. Since each of these touch points give you customer level feedback most often, but you'll have to aggregate them to some common touch points, common dimensions. For example, you could roll them up to a geography level. You could roll them up to a product level. There are several common dimensions you'll be able to identify which are important for your business. So that way I can find out across all of these channels I'm listening to, what are customers talking to me about product A or product B. That is something that you can aggregate and find out what is the total feedback about. And finally, a lot of the work in integration is in pattern spotting, by applying heavy business context, and by bringing in a lot of thought leadership in terms of what is the right way to look at customer for your specific business, for your customer segments. How should you handle them? So spotting patterns by comparing insights is important, where you use some of these frameworks, but ultimately you evolve an integrated narrative wherein you say that this is the headline that I want to share, that across all of these channels, across all of the feedback I'm getting from, say, marketing, from sales, about the product teams, or about competitive intelligence, this is what the overall message I'm getting. And another point I was talking about earlier was not every feedback and not every channel is important. When you integrate the streams, you will have to give higher weightage to certain more qualified streams. For example, if you think that voice of customer has much more qualified data because you know the audience and you have certain questions, leading questions that the people are answering, that will be that needs to be given a higher weightage. So that is a methodology you need to use to integrate all of this together. And once you achieve that, you end up with an integrated view across the different channels, whether it is social media, interviews, research reports, website clickstream, and a number of other channels, and across the different divisions, whether the feedback is coming about from your customer service interactions, or from product channel interactions, or from competitor sales or market inputs. So all of these different in a way horizontals and verticals, when you bring them all together, you get an integrated view which tells you one headline on what you need to take away. The final step and the most important one is, how do you bring all of this together and drive actions? So far, people who are like deep in the trenches, who have been working with data, will be able to piece them all together. But it is important to make sure that this is communicated the right way and it drives actions through data stories. So we found that a final layer of visual storytelling or information design is useful, not just for the representational aspects, but this has much more fundamental aspects in terms of bringing the right lens to look at the insights. To give you an example, look at this framework from Bain Consulting. So this is a great example on how all of the feedback we've looked at so far has been put in together. So this is a retail bank who are looking at the different customer interactions, and they are identifying the different episodes or the different interactions which will eventually roll up to the journey step. And we have what is important for the customer and what the customer is trying to achieve in each of these episodes. So you have customers who talk about help with products, or there are instances on how you are trying to deal with fraud when a fraud happens, or they're applying for a mortgage or opening an account. All of these are customer interactions which happen with an organization, with a brand, and some of them have the customers are happy about, and some of them there's a scope to get more delighted. So the way to read this would be, the x-axis has the potential to anger, how important it is for the customer and what is the extent of causing dissatisfaction. And whereas on the y-axis you have the potential to delight. So not every activity which could lead to delight might be important, and vice versa. So anything such as an unplanned overdraft can cause a lot of concern and anger for the customer, but fixing it doesn't lead to delight by itself. So some of these are hygiene aspects which you'll have to take care. So you will have to prioritize these initiatives and see where you need to fix, what you should take up as an improvement to make sure you convert customers into promoters, how to retain customers. So after looking at all of these, the size is how often each of these episodes happen. And the color indicates the gap versus the market leader. A darker color means there's a bigger gap of this bank vis-a-vis a market leader. So after having evaluated all of these, you don't go with something which happens too often. For instance, the bigger bubbles are not the areas where you put in the money, and the ones on the right extreme of the x-axis, it's not naturally, this is not the one where you would want to put in all your money. You need to take care of it, but if you were to hyper optimize something, this has been identified as an episode to go after dealing with fraud. So this has moderate chance for angering the customer, but when a fraud happens, a fraudulent, say a credit card transaction or a bank transaction happens, if the bank assures the customer and has a speedy response to resolve it and provide some financial protection, this has a great chance to provide delight to the customer. So this is something which eventually in this case the bank took up and optimized. So similarly for every organization, when you lay out all of your journey steps and all of the initiatives which fall into the journey steps, whether you're talking about usage of the product or onboarding or pricing, there are several individual interactions which happen, the different processes in your journey step. Lay all of them out in a framework such as this. You can choose the axis based on the data that you have. For example, one could be how happy are the customers, the positivity. We looked at the emotion of the text feedback the customer has given. Are they happy or unhappy? And another important lever could be what is the impact it has on the overall satisfaction. In a way, we are saying how important is that particular process step for the overall satisfaction of the customer. So this is where we talked about not every step, not every journey step being important. So when you are able to identify the quantitative impact of every step on the overall outcome, you will be able to place it in this framework and decide which are those journey steps which are most important for the customer, likely to lead to conversion of a detractor into promoter, and which ones are causing heartburn to the customers today. So if I prioritize those ones where people are unhappy today, but there is a greater chance for this to get converted into a delight. So those are the areas I need to put in my money and improve to get the maximum ROI from the CX initiative. So this is possible if we look at the storytelling framework, look at a visual representation, and bring in the business consulting aspect on what is the right lens to use to analyze the insights and present it to decision makers. Ways to do this: firstly, we need to reorganize and come up with cross-functional teams. Many organizations we've seen they have their functional teams separate from the technology data science teams. So you need to come up with cross-functional multidisciplinary skilled team where you have people who come up with not just the analytics and the CX domain aspects, but you need to bring in people from psychology or psychography background where you have the behavioral experts, the software aspects, people who understand the customer. If they come in and talk about why a customer is behaving the same way, you would be able to use data to see what might bring about a change. So cross-functional teams is one key thing. Second one is come up with a visual narrative, use the right visual representations and come up with a narrative that lays out the insights to promote decision making. And finally, measure the progress and check what is the return on investment. When you track this period over period, you will be able to find out whether some of these initiatives are giving you the intended benefits, or should you put in your money into some other journey step or some other process within that. So that kind of brings us to the end of this framework. I have one case study to run through, but before that I wanted to do a quick poll to understand what is the current customer experience toolset that you use. We talked about several aspects here, and which of these are you already using? So let me activate the final poll. Which of the methodologies are you using today? Do you have a custom taxonomy for the business? That is an important first step, because you then start placing all the feedback based on the custom language that your customers or your business understands. Customer journey mapping we spoke about, integrated view we spoke about. Orchestration of journeys is where you tie the decisions back to customer events. We talked about a framework on how you can look at interaction and drive decisions. What if you can automate this end to end? You have different customer events, and if you tie this to the journey steps and a prioritization exercise, you will be able to find out which journey steps or which decisions need to be automatically enabled when an event happens. For instance, if there is some message which goes viral, or there is a mass recall of products, or any event which happens in the market, uh, is there some automated response that you can bring in? So that's the orchestration of journeys. So this is what you've said. Okay, large majority of you do customer journey mapping. That's great. It's a very important first step. Integrated view of the customer, about 64%. That's great. Actually, what we've seen and what organizations talk about, the market research reports talk about, is the maturity level is much less. Not many people have moved to an integrated view, but this audience, you seem to be doing that already, and you have, most of you, at least half of you, have a custom taxonomy. Great. So let me move on to the case study. So I wanted to talk about how we helped a technology major transform their customer experience and listen better to the customer. So the challenge here the customer was facing was how to drive customer satisfaction, how to drive revenues through better satisfied customers. So that was a question we were trying to answer as a broad objective. To achieve that, we went through the steps we spoke about. We identified the different sources, the different channels, and we did a step-by-step approach in terms of picking a certain set of channels to start with, get to a certain level of maturity, and then over time, keep adding newer channels, keep adding newer listening sources. So that way we came up with a solution framework on how to tie in the conversations and interactions with the customer back to the decisions using the 5-step framework we spoke about. And we used a variety of analytics techniques from the toolbox, starting with the basic exploratory analysis, statistics, to language models which use deep learning algorithms to make sense of the customer feedback. All of this was analyzed and put into perspective as to where it falls within the customer's journey step. So there was a custom journey step that we were using specific to the customer, and we laid all this feedback back onto this journey step. And then we rolled up all of this into an integrated experience. So there was value in looking at individual the individual levers of listening. When we look at, for instance, the social listening, or we talk about voice of customer, or we talk about, say, channel, there is value in looking at these individual touch points. And when we roll this up to integrate it, it gave us a broad narrative on how we can prioritize the different initiatives. And then we built a suite of interactive data science application with several stories. And this we found as most important and most powerful to drive decisions. So the insights were presented through visualizations and with interactivity customized to a specific role of the user. We were able to identify and present the specific recommendations for each user. And finally, all of this, when we were able to measure it and track it quarter over quarter, we were able to see how the net promoter score was improving, how we were able to translate and convert some of the detractors into promoters. So that led to substantial improvement, not just in the NPS score, but also in a measurable ROI to the tune of about $40 to $50 million over time, where the additional incremental business from satisfied customers was something which the customer was able to achieve. So that brings me to the end of this session. To do a quick recap, we looked at the 5-step framework. We need to listen to the customers, look at the various channels at your disposal. There are several sources. Find out how you can tap into all of that. Understand what the customers want. Start with the business questions. Use your analytics toolbox to answer those questions. And after you identify the insights, contextualize it, because an insight is useful only when placed in the right context. So we looked at the customer journey map, the 6-step journey map, which you can further fine-tune based on your specific business. And we looked at various ways on how you can pick the interaction and contextualize it. And then we talked about integration, how we can roll all of this together to come up with the overall narrative. And finally, we talked about action, how you can convert these contextualized integrated insights into actionable data stories by using data visualization, by bringing in multi-skilled team, and by setting up a measurable framework to look at the ROI period over period. So that let me take a pause there, and let me open this for questions.